ever to rise to the rank of captain of the United States Navy. There's been none other but Stephen Decatur at that age. Now what happened though was, and as you know, officers in any military institution, everything's by rank and tenure and what you've accomplished, what battles you've been in. So there were quite a few naval officers that should have been elevated to captain before Decatur was. But they so honored what he did that they went ahead and elevated him, but it just really didn't go down well with a lot of officers. And so one of the officers that Stephen Decatur really had been a student of was James Barron. And James Barron was about 9 years older than Stephen Decatur, and back then that's a long time. So Stephen Decatur had actually been an understudy on one of the ships that Barron had commanded and loved the man, said of him, "I honor and love this man. He was one of my mentors and taught me so much about seamanship and battle and strategy and so on." But Barron was just resented that Stephen Decatur got elevated. And as you'll see from this picture, you know, Decatur, he dressed to the nines. I mean, he just always kind of flaunted his elevation and his epaulets, which are these things here. And, you know, wore his medals prominently. And it's said of him that when he would walk into a room, I mean, people would know there's somebody of prominence there. He was pretty brash and pretty out there. They said that he never picked a duel. He never initiated a duel with anyone, but he never turned one down if he was challenged. In fact, he had some of his understudies that were challenged in duels, and you know, you could be challenged in a duel just by not saluting an officer. Yeah, I mean, you say some misstep, and you could be. Honor was a huge thing then, and dueling though was banned by that time in the District of Columbia, and Commodore James Barron just kept writing letters, you know, pushing on Stephen Decatur really to go to the fields, as they were called. The field was where they did the dueling. And in a duel, you have a second who actually negotiates with the other officer's second. And they talk back and forth, and they decide what's going to be the weapons. Are they going to be swords, you know, whatever it's going to be, or it's going to be what are then smoothbore pistols. And a lot of the pistols back then being smoothbore, they were very inaccurate. So in many a duel, nobody was killed because the bullet would go off somewhere because, you know, there was very little control. And they were flintlocks, you know, at the time. Well, Decatur's second was Bainbridge, who was the captain of the Philadelphia that he later freed. He showed up about 3 months before the duel finally happened. And Susan, his wife, his surviving wife, wrote of this and said, it was so odd that Bainbridge just was Mr. Friendly. Oh, the Decaturs, how are you? Well, Stephen Decatur honored him and so on, but it was a little, you know, myth that he was so friendly because he'd been out of communication for a long period of time. And finally shows up. Susan later said that this was a murderous plot between Bainbridge and Commodore James Barron. And James Barron's second literally hated Stephen Decatur. And there was some other ends. Fulton, you know, the guy that did the steamboat, he was a good buddy of Stephen Decatur. Fulton was just beginning to develop the steam engine and the steamship, and Decatur was wealthy by then because when a captain of a ship, particularly in war, captured another ship, they got all that. Now we didn't enslave their sailors and sell their women off into harems, but we got to keep the cargo. So Decatur was quite wealthy. That's how he built this mansion there, because he was quite wealthy by the time he built this. He built it in 1918. He only lived in it about 12 months before the duel. And so James Barron just resented Stephen Decatur, and there was another incident in Norfolk, Virginia. Stephen Decatur had been dating some girl back in Philadelphia, but he had broken it off with her, and James Barron had not heard about that, you know, because mind you, Stephen Decatur in 1809 when he married Susan, he was a national hero by then. James Barron just didn't keep up with all the latest, so he had broken it off there. But Barron and Decatur and a group of officers with Barron and his men had passed one another, and he made some comment about this girl in Philadelphia. But Stephen Decatur had already broken off, was dating Susan, Susan, I've forgotten her last name. She was the daughter of the mayor of Norfolk, Virginia, big naval place. So he was already, you know, fully engaged and involved with Susan, and Barron made some comment about this girl back there, and it just offended Stephen Decatur. that another officer wasn't up on what was going on and would make some reference to a girl he had already dumped and now was dating, you know, this other one. So there were small, you would think very small incidents, but among officers, you know, you just highly respect their office, their accomplishments, and so on. So whenever there was dishonor, you know, they had the opportunity to call for a duel. Oftentimes, you know, the seconds would negotiate them, and oftentimes if they'd end up in a duel, it generally was 10 paces, you know, from back to back, 10 paces, each with their pistols, you know, and they would mark it out, and the guy would be calling it out there. They would say, and they'd stop, turn, and on the count of, any time after the count of 3, you could shoot. And the guy would call out, and most of the guys would raise their pistols. He'd call out 1, 2, 3, and any time after that, you could fire. Stephen Decatur's second, Bainbridge, the former captain of the U.S. Philadelphia, agreed to 6 paces. And Susan investigated this, his wife. Why 6? Well, as it turned out, Bainbridge claimed poor eyesight. I can't see anything at 10 paces. Will you agree to 6? And that's why Susan says that Bainbridge and the rest of them were out in cahoots to kill Decatur. And so he agreed to 6 paces. And Decatur told Bainbridge, I shall be mortally wounded. He knew that at 6 paces, it was too short a distance, that smoothbore pistol would probably strike its mark. And Stephen Decatur told Bainbridge, I shall shoot Samuel Barron in the thigh. And that's exactly what happened. Decatur shot Barron and hit him in the thigh, but Barron shot Decatur right here in the groin. And at that day and time, internal bleeding. It took about 6 hours. He was carried back by carriage from the fields in Maryland back to his mansion there in Decatur, in D.C. at the Lafayette Square, and placed on a cot. He had not told Susan that he was going to do this duel because it was banned already in the district. And he didn't tell Susan what was happening. He didn't tell anybody. Only his second, a few other of his closest friends knew that he was going to go do this. And so he bled to death finally there on this cart. And I've stood by the very window where that was, just inside the front door and off to the left. In fact, the curator and I tried to invoke the ghost of Stephen Decatur. So I was dressed like this, I'm doing this thing, but nothing happened.